Alright, so this is going to be the part that covers Milestone 4, and this is going to basically just cover the features that were required as part of Milestone 4. So that amounts pretty much just to the menu options, the menu title, the various items for the menu, the fact that the game is now broken apart into different screens, that there's a main menu with the options menu and everything else. And as you can see right here, it looks kind of chaotic because I am actually displaying everything all at once. But as soon as we hit the play button, you give that a listen, you can actually hear that music in the background. And I don't know how loud it is for you, but it's pretty loud for me. So I'm going to turn that down just low enough that you'll be able to still hear the game. Or let's turn that a little lower. As you can see, as I'm clicking in between the start menu and the options menu, you can see that as I'm going back and forward between the two, it's actually saving the stuff, and we'll cover the code for that a little bit later. But we have the map of the day, we have the level seed over here, we have the sound effects volume, we have the player count, and then we have the master volume up here. And one of the unique features for mine is actually the master volume and the fact that I'm using sliders instead of buttons, because I wanted to make it so that the player couldn't put in a value over what they were expecting without having to disable buttons. So to do this, I use sliders instead of buttons. And another advantage of this is that because the value from the slider is taken at the end of the update, I don't have to handle a button click every time somebody wants to turn up the volume or turn down the volume. The one thing I didn't do is you could do these so that on after update they push the information that they contain, and I just chose not to do that just because. So then moving on, we go ahead and we can go into the start game. And one of the unique things that I did with this one, you can hear the chink 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 sounds. That's actually the enemy ships firing. And since I used a coin sounds, that's them actually shooting at the player when the player is in range. And now that my player ship is actually far enough away from them, you can no longer hear them shooting anymore. But one of the unique things that I did with the camera is I kind of gave it like a Battlestar Galactica kind of effect to it. So whenever the ship turns, it actually zooms out. You'll notice that when it's just moving forward and backwards, it kind of stays close to it, but as soon as you start to turn the ship, the camera itself zooms out really far. And I just wanted to do that as like a unique graphic effect to make my game visually pop more. Another one of the things that wasn't required by the project is I actually put in directional lighting, because the ship model that I'm using actually has specular highlights, and I wanted to take advantage of that using directional highlight. So you can actually see that it sets up very nice directional looks. Yeah, but earlier than that, I was also having some problems with getting the camera to work, and eventually experimenting with it and playing around with it actually got me to the point where I got to this camera, because it uses an interrelation between the transform of the ship here and the transform of the empty game object that everything else is on. So when it zooms out like this and it slowly lerps back to its previous turn setting, you can actually see the transition. And the main reason I just did that is because I wanted a better graphical look for it. But okay, I rigged it up so that I can press the L button to increment the score over here. And when I increment the score, you see it tick up over there. And then when I hit O, which I set up, it actually decrements the lives. So after 0 lives, I get the game over screen, and there's the high score. And then clicking the game over screen takes me back to the start menu. Now, of course, since I'm actually running this inside of the game window itself instead of a compiled program, the exit game button does not work, because quit application only works when it's running through a build. It doesn't work when it's still in the window here. High score is fairly self-explanatory. I'll go ahead and take a moment to go through all the options. You just heard the button clicks. Return to main, options. Since I have my music volume turned down so far, you can hear the button clicks. Level seed here, it takes a number between 0 and 24 and determines which part of the integer array it starts on for the level seeding, and then the level seeds off of the basis of the level seed and everything else, and it looks down from there. I'll just go ahead and demonstrate player count right here. And all I'm going to do with this one is I'm just going to really quickly show the fact that I have 2 individual cameras. I did top on bottom just because of the way the cameras are stacked up. And you can see that since I don't have as much screen space to play with, I didn't get quite as intense on it. These are actually different objects, which I felt was kind of a good idea for it, and that's one of the extra things that I did, because I could actually go in there and change which ship models I'm using for these, or even repaint them. So the Player 1 and Player 2 ships are actually 2 different ship prefabs. They're not the same ship prefab, which is kind of nice, because that means that I don't have to worry about accidentally altering one of them, and it's very easy to change or alter the camera setup types with it. So one of the really nice things on having them as 2 separate objects instead of code instantiating them is it leaves the camera setup to be more readily manipulated by designers rather than just being script manipulated in the background. And one of the really cool things about this is that if at some later point a game designer comes in and they say, okay, well, our target audience has a predilection to own 2 monitors. So it's like, okay, so our target audience owns 2 monitors. That means we can go back into the game object and change the camera setup on the prefab. So, okay, now Player 1 is on display 1 and Player 2 is on display 2, which is nice, because if I was just going to instantiate the camera script-wise, which I was fooling around with and was able to pull off, I just decided not to keep that implementation because it felt clunky. But with being able to go back into the inspector or go into the object manager here or the prefabs down here, which is where it's actually at, because here's player ship 1, player ship 2, and here's the actual player ship prefab that I use for the single player game. What that allows me to do is, like, if I go straight to here and go ahead and close ship 8, go to camera here, you can see that I have my camera set up right here. But the thing that it can do is, if a designer wanted to come back in and change the target display from display 1 to display 2, they could, and it would work, and it's much easier for them to reach than if I was to do something script-wise, because if I was going to do something script-wise, I would have to come down in here, I'd have to add an enumerator, I'd have to say, okay, so are they sharing the same screen, or are they on different screens? And then I'd have to have a different enumerator to declare which screen such a player is going to be on, and it just gets to be a mess. So when I was researching camera stuff, because originally I really screwed up the camera, because the camera was actually a subpart of the ship here, and as you can see with the ship here, it's actually been scaled down, so it's currently 1/8 of its original size, which means that the camera was also 1/8 of its original size because it was a child of ship 8 rather than being a child of the parent empty as it is now. And what that caused to happen was fun, complete, utter fun. No, it was a nightmare. Because it would work just fine going forwards and backwards, but oops, did not mean to remove camera follow. No, 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 no. They did not mean for that to happen. Oh, no, wait, that was 11. No. Removing component, no. Bad, no. Undo, do not want. Yeah, but originally, one of the things that I was having issues with was the camera, because the ship would move forward and backwards very easily, but as soon as I turned it and tried to move it, the screen would glitch out, because apparently the camera was having calculation problems with the frustum because the camera had been scaled down because I had scaled down the ship. And after conferring with Hendry, I was able to correct that because he told me about the whole fact of it, you know. Ew. Why is that so far forward? This is supposed to be. And then I have to. Yeah. Nope, too high. Yeah, that gets wonky. But that's okay because with the way that the camera works, I actually just have to. I can actually set this all to 0 because with the way the frustum works, is since the offset's like this and since the camera follow slip, which I wasn't trying to remove, I was trying to do the edit. The setups for the cameras inside of the inspector don't matter because it's using late update, which takes an offset of the camera and it actually does a alert to change the position of the camera, and then it does a transform.lookAt. So it automatically points the camera at the ship, and the interrelation between the camera being a child of the parent transform and the camera being pointed at the ship is what gives it that Battlestar Galactica kind of twirl, because it's to put it very accurately, the camera is like on a gimbal mount that's on a crane arm. So as the ship's moving around, it's interrelated and triangulating it from the parent object and where the ship's currently located, and then also doing a rotation at the same time. So anytime the ship is turning, you get this long sight on. And another thing is because I'm using the lerp, and I'm using, as you can see here, the time dot delta time, because I had to redo the cameras anyways because they were now going to be a child object instead of a fixed position camera. What you saw was the time dot delta time times the smoothing speed brought into the lerp in order to re-angle and reposition the camera to correctly display where the ship is, and this interrelation, because the camera is like on that gimbal, on that crane arm, looking at it, gives a much more dynamic look to what is essentially an extremely simple game. And yeah, that is pretty much the main extra that I worked on, because everything else is pretty rote. I'll just go ahead and disable some of these so that the other two are a lot more visible. So for here, we have the start game, we have the options, we have the high score, we have the exit game. The exit game I will demonstrate at the end of the video just to show you that the game does build, the game does run, and when I hit the exit game, it quits. Because yes. So the starting screen really just has the 4 buttons. The 4 buttons are set up in a very standard manner. It's not really required as part of the conditions, but here's the on-click, the button handler. There's the assigned sound. I did not spend a lot of time hunting for audio sounds to make this look really cool or sound really cool. I really just did them as placeholders because I could honestly spend a day alone just looking for sounds for the game, and I've recognized my weakness in this. Fortunately, in the real world, there are typically people who do nothing but design the sounds in the games and everything else. I know full well they exist, and I also realize full well that if I tried to do that, I would waste a ton of time instead of getting the project done. But yeah, so when this is just the menu manager, it contains the menu manager script. This menu manager script is predominantly responsible for loading the previous saved information or saving the current options information so that it persists between load screens, which is cool. I'll switch the managers here. Well, the manager is just like sitting off in no man's land, but that's neither here nor there because it's just an empty. All it does is it holds my game manager script. And you can see the inspector here, the map seed. These are all pretty much just the default values that load if you don't have a attached script. Here's the musics, audio clips loaded up into here. Current scene, start screen, select players, 2 players. Obviously, since it starts off with 1 player, it automatically overwrites that because I already have player prefs set up beforehand. Although this one, these are just like the default values that Game Manager begins with. But when Game Manager actually loads, it goes ahead and overrides them. It's map seed, player health, player vulnerability time, kamikaze health, hunter health, wanderer health, lost health, player fire rate, player forward speed, or player backward speed, enemy speed, enemy rotate speed, enemy fire rate, enemy engagement distance. This is actually pretty big, which is why you heard the enemies shooting almost as soon as I got into there. Enemy hearing distance. This is the main thing with the hear, turn, look at, and shoot. This is the predominant thing with the enemy hearing distance. One of the really cool things is when you have the... Where'd it go? The enemy engagement distance. One of the interesting things is when I leave the enemy AI in its base state, it actually is following the flee script when you are within the engagement distance. So when you've actually closed to 15 unity units of the enemy, it will stop firing at you, which is cool because that is when it kicks in the evade script. Although I didn't demonstrate that in this video. It's not really a critical part of it. This just controls how frequently the enemy looks for you in their field of view. Currently, the enemy is set up to shoot at you even if they can't see you, because they don't do a raycast check in order to see if they can actually see you before they fire, because that's not part of the firing script. The main reason I disabled that for this video was that I wanted you to be able to hear, as you're watching this video, the enemy firing at me. So that was deliberate. Because otherwise it will actually check to see you, and if it can't see you, it will force the passive listen state instead of the fire state, because since I went into the script and disabled that portion of it, I'm not going to show the code because it's not a part of this milestone, but since I disabled that part of it, it will just attempt to shoot at you even if it can't see you, just because I wanted the viewer to be able to hear the enemy shooting. Yeah, and like I said, I have different models for the player ship. So here's the single player ship, and here's the player 1 ship, and the player 2 ship. And these are just the enemies. You can load up different types of enemies, and you can even set different enemy AI states. I just used the same basic model for all 3 of them. But I have 4 different AI states for it, and they're all finite machines, and they all actually transition between one another, which is kind of cool. Here's the global for the player score. That's pretty simple. I didn't implement it, but there was supposed to be like a cash sign pickup thing that would have given you 600 points when you ran over it. But right now, it just goes chink if you hit it, and it uses coin sound 4, which kind of makes it funny. And there's the Bob script. I just did that for visual aesthetic. The only difference that I have for the pickups is that instead of having your typical on-trigger enter, they actually use on-trigger exit, so that they trigger the pickup when the player has passed through them, not when the player first touches them. Which is nice, because, I mean, that's more realistic for the pickups than just automatically picking them up the instant you hit them. Because that can be a little bit jarring, actually, because it takes a little bit for you to recognize that your ship has run over the pickup, and because I'll up the prefab here, you can see the collider for the pickup is massive, so you're actually in the collider before you're even next to the pickup. And the main reason I did that was because since they have the bob and rotate script on them, that's what's making them go turn and go up and down. The collider on the bottom is actually big enough so that you're effectively still in the collider even when it's at the height of its bob. So you're not prevented from being able to pick them up just because you are under them. Because the collider needed to be bigger than the actual object itself so that the players wouldn't be impeded from being able to pick them up just because they weren't colliding with the cube object base itself. But yeah. Okay. Alright, let's go into the nastiness of the code. So let's go ahead and start with, I believe, menu. Oh, we did camera follower. So let's go ahead and start with menu manager. Menu manager is the one that pretty much just handles what the current menu set is currently set on, and it just does that with an update. And the way that you can force the change of the menu is by reassigning the value currently set to this menu. So what this menu does is it basically just sets the game object states of the parent objects for the various menus to either true or false, which makes them appear or disappear on the screen, and also makes their controls active or inactive depending on it. So that's very simple. What I do is I just pass the game objects into the public, and I assign them a direct value rather than putting them into an array, so that I have a name I can just simply use instead of using in a slotted array number, which makes the menu godly easier to code because now I actually have a proper name that I can refer to the game objects by rather than having an array with a number index that I have to use. I can just use main menu.setActive true. And all that does is it enables or disables a Unity game object. And all you do is you pass in a boolean and it either sets it active or it sets it inactive. And that's all it does. For the set options menu, here's where we get to the part where I pull the information, and like right here, my game manager equals game manager.thisManager. It checks to see if my game manager is null. If it is, then it sets it to the current global public static instance of this manager, which is going to be the currently running instance of game manager, which has existed since I started making this game. But it's the main thing that the designer will tinker with in the inspector. And what we have down here is it creates an instance, or it creates a container to hold an instance of an already existing game object, which is going to be the control that is the master volume slider. And what it does with that is then it loads the value into the slider from the game manager. And this is all set up previously right here with the Stagehand. And that's pretty simple, because stagehand.thisHand.getSaveData loads all of the player prefs. And then the player prefs are pushed into the options menu, and the options menu goes ahead and sets them to work. Fairly simple. This entire block of code just sets the option menu. That is literally all it's for. And this entire one just and this one saves the player pref values. That's literally all it does. It creates game objects just like the ones up here that hold the game objects with those specific tags. And then what it does is it gets the float, it pushes the float to the game manager up here, and then down here it saves it to the player profiles. That's it. That is absolutely all it does. And the only real notable thing is that I have to convert a bool here to an integer, but I do that in Stagehand. And then down here I actually have to convert an integer to a bool, and I do that when I'm pulling doing oh god, where did I do it? Right here. That's actually converting it from a float to an integer, because you can't static cast a integer to float to an integer. You actually have to deliberately cast it, but that's not here or there. The only other thing that we have is the button handler, which is fairly straightforward too. Button handler, all button handler really does is it provides the functions for all the various buttons. Update sound data is really simple. It just pushes and pulls the sound data as soon as you're done. And then it resets the intro musics. We'll actually cover the audio handler too, because that's a large part of this project. Despite the fact that you could obviously hear it working, it's just a nicety. And here's the function for the quit game button. When, I mean, literally the code for it. Application. So the exit the game during a built game. So after the game is built, you just hit the button. It kicks the quit game function. The quit game function goes, oh, okay, phone, and you're done. Alright, so there's the starting screen. The starting screen, the options button, you hit the options, you go to the options screen. The start button, you hit the start button, you start the game. The high score button, you hit the high score button, you go to the high score screen. I'll show the high score screen. There's really nothing to it. It's just a talk. It's just a text. It updates. It pulls the information to display the score in the text screen, and that's really all there is to it. So I'll go ahead and disable the starting screen and enable the options screen. Options screen is very straightforward. You really just have the values that it sets. So for the master volume, the music volume, and the sound effects volume, I just wanted to use a float. So as you can see here, I have the minimum value set to 0 and the max value set to 1, and I have the whole numbers checkbox unchecked. So that clearly indicates that it is going to use some value between, including or between 0 and 1, to say it correctly in the geometric terms. And then like down here, where it actually counts, I have force whole numbers. And it goes from 1 to 2, so 1 player or 2 player. And then over here, we have the seed value. I have that going from 0 to 24, and it forces whole numbers as well. Then up here, we have the toggle button for map of the day. Since this is actually a Boolean value and is on, which is the Boolean value that indicates whether or not the box is checked. This determines if it's going to use the seed number or if it's going to determine which portion of the array of lists it's going to start on the basis of what day of the week it is. Okay. And I'll go ahead and uncheck the options in the starting screen. And we can see the highest score of all time, score. Score actually gets replaced by the text, and that's part of the update display text, which is also what I used for the player HUD, which is pretty cool because all that does is it pushes the update for the get lives and the player score, and that's what populates in the top side of the window. It's actually not a mono. It behaves kind of like a mono just for the sake of the enumerator, but it's not really a mono because it only exists in the class that it's on. It doesn't exist globally. So only when it's attached to an object does it exist, and it only exists on that object. So really the best way to deal with it is just to set the enumerator in the inspector screen, because that determines what actually fills in the text box. So I have it set to score as the default value for the text, to begin with, but the instant it updates for the first time, that gets overwritten, which is nice. Go ahead and re-enable these and switch the scene. Yeah. You know what? Let's hit the sound manager before we change the scene. Okay, so sound manager, you actually have two different audio sources. And one of these audio sources is sound effects, the other is music. But I set that hard. So here in the sound manager, we just have your classic awake. We want this to be the Highlander. There can be only one. And all that really does is it makes it so that I can't have more than one audio source, which isn't typically a problem in video games. It's the audio listener that you need to watch out for. But as you can see down here, I just have two public options. One of them is the effects one, where you can play the effect. And what that does is it says effect source.volume equals this volume and effect source.clip equals clip. And then down here you have the play music. And what that does is this one is actually completely set up to stop the previous track and start the next one because they're all using the same audio source. So the instant that I need to change the music, it stops the previous music and starts the next one. And the best part about that is the fact that by breaking it apart like this and manipulating the class through a breakdown like this, I could have used like with music source. I could have done with music source dot stop dot loop dot clip dot volume dot play and with. But for if somebody who's more novice at programming than I am were to come up and try to support that, and they didn't have the database developer background that I do, it would be confusing as hell because it looks completely syntax wrong. It just is easier to read for me because like the back end on most of the database functions is like this long, or it's an enumerator, so it's just ugly. But this is very easy to read, and it tells you exactly what it's manipulating. It's not really that hard. I tried to use I definitely tried to use variable names that were sensical to what was going on. Going back over here. So that was the sound manager. The sound manager is very straightforward. The sound manager was just pretty much a container for the sound manager, for the audio sources, for the music and the sound effects. And really, it just exists. And since I'll show you here, I actually changed the fall off so that there is no fall off. It's just global sound. Not exactly the best thing you want to do for a AAA title, but for an indie game or for a student project, it's completely fine. There's no ambiance, it's just everywhere. Oh, but yeah. That's one of the other things that I did is I have global sound for my game instead of having regional sound. There's no... There aren't audio listeners attached to the... there aren't audio sources attached to the ships themselves because the audio listener has to be on an individual global thing. Because all the cameras that I use, the only camera that has an audio listener on it is, well, there's two. The one for the main screen and the one for the game over screen. Because everywhere else, the audio for level itself, the audio listeners are actually on an empty. And I'll go ahead and show that to you right now, because that's a large part of implementing the audio in this. And yeah, just to show you, everything is organized in its own files, which is really nice because some of the prefab stuff that came in a huge folder. So I'll go to scripts here, and you can see that that's all organized in the scripts. But I'll go ahead and go to level 1. And you can see the hearing aid. Hearing aid is actually an empty, which has nothing but an audio listener on it. And the purpose behind that is because I could have a variable number of players. I can't put a listener on the camera for multiple players because Unity does not like having multiple listeners in a scene. And that's just the way it is. Here's the directional light that I was talking about. And this is what was giving me my angular lighting in the maze, which was giving it the shadows and everything else, which was making it pretty nice looking. The scene manager, this actually just gets overwritten because the scene manager from the previous one just overwrites it. Same for the game manager, same for the map generator, same for the sound manager. As soon as it enters into these scenes, the previous ones have don't destroy and load, so as soon as it tries to set it up with the awake, it goes, oh, I am not the first one, therefore I am slain, because we are playing Highlander. And that's what it pretty much does. So, yeah, there really is nothing else to look at inside of there really is nothing to look at inside of level 1. And then just here for the game over screen, we have the canvas, and the canvas, as you can see here, is set to screen space camera, and then it's just given the main camera. Main camera doesn't even have the main camera tag on it, because that's another problem you can have with the cameras. If you leave the main camera tag on the cameras, when you have more than one camera in the scene, that causes problems. Try again button is very simple. With try again button, you just take it right straight back to the start again. Can have a click sound, doesn't have a click sound, doesn't need a click sound, has an audio source on it. But yeah, you click on it, you click the button, it goes back to the start. Yay! You're done. I suppose I should go into button handler. Have I already gotten button handler? Oh. So another thing that you could do here is, because button handler actually has that, I don't have it open yet, so I'll go ahead and open it because it's a really big piece of the program, Stagehand. This is where I actually do a lot of this stuff, and so with Stagehand, I would do, say, I'm just doing this as an example, but set new high score. So I just do stage hand dot this hand dot set new high score. And all that's going to do for me is set an additional, is going to push the set the high score. And what that does is it takes the incoming high score, compares it against the previous high score, and if it is bigger than the previous high score, it saves that one, so it overwrites it. So if I go back to button handler here, I want to do game manager dot, no, not my game manager, just game manager. And all that does is it pulls my current player score from the manager, and then when you click it, it pushes it back to 0. So, but it was already doing that as part of the game manager. But here's Stagehand. Okay, Stagehand exists between the levels because it has this don't destroy and load. Um, I call it Stagehand, but really 90% of what it does is it just goes ahead and loads up the scenes, and it gets some of the save data in order to get it started with the music. And here's the int to bool, where it converts from an integer to a bool. Because player prefs, surprise me poorly, does not save Boolean information. Fun, fun, fun. So, in order to get player prefs to work, to work for me to fill a Boolean, I had to make my own little converter scripts. So, it saves one way, bool it in. So it converts the Boolean that I get from the day seed into an integer using that one. And then it converts the integer to a Boolean. Or it's just simple. It's annoying, but it's simple. I actually use finite states to define what state my game currently is in. And this is using the singleton method in order to switch between the screens. So with the singleton method, and the name is self-explanatory, game manager current scene dot start screen, game manager this manager dot this scene. Okay, so the current instance, so we have the game manager, the current instance of the game manager global, and what is its current scene? Okay, so it goes game manager, enumeration, current scene, start screen. And yeah, that's all it does. This pushes the information in to save for the high score. There's no reason to save the high score with the regular save data, because the high score is only supposed to update when it is greater than the previous highest score. So this updates most of the save data to the player prefs, converting where needed, looking at U Boolean. And this saves the high score when it needs to save the high score. And that's it. That is it, pretty much, for it. Which kind of seems apathetic, but okay. Gonna go ahead and check. Okay, so we got the start screen, we got the game over screen, we got the UI, we got the option menu, we got the sounds, we got the split screen multiplayer. Woo! We're done! And I'm going to submit this video also for the final. So, 2 videos, same path. Because I took so long, I just decided to put the final bit of polish on it. Thank you for your time.